welcome to the podcast. I'm Karen Weaver. Collegiate athletics has never seen so much change coming at us so fast. Athletic departments continue to deal with the fallout of the pandemic, the safety, mental health, and well-being of their student athletes, conference realignment, the advances in data around human performance, maintaining fiscal resiliency, and now, of course, names, images, and likenesses, and the recent labor opinion from the General Counsel of the NLRB. There's a lot going on here. Today I want to talk about how these changes are affecting how university leaders, including athletic department leaders, are evaluating their current policies and procedures surrounding risk management and compliance. Simply, how do you keep the university out of trouble when the goalposts keep shifting? My guests today are two consultants from Baker Tilly, a top 10 advisory and consulting firm that supports higher education. Dave Capitano has more than 30 years of experience working with college and university leadership and boards, is a CPA, and he hosts the podcast Higher Ed Advisor. He leads the firm's higher education practice and co-leads the college sports division. Adrienne Larmet is a senior manager in the risk advisory practice, focusing on internal audit and enterprise risk management. If ever an enterprise was under great stress and risk, it is college athletics today. Adrienne and Dave, welcome to the podcast. So glad to have you here.
We're thrilled to be here. Thank you for having us.
Yes, Karen, it's an honor. Thank you so much.
So you both work in risk management, and I want to ask you each to comment from your vantage point on the very unusual and dynamic memo that came from the NLRA's General Counsel. First, help our listeners understand what, if any, risk management concerns have prevented colleges from allowing graduate students and other student classifications. Most know the story of the birth of the term student athlete, but is there a bigger concern lurking in the shadows, like changing of tax status or creating of layers upon layers of administrative burdens to document an athlete's workplace and hours? And either one of you can take it.
Adrienne, maybe I'll start and then
Perfect.
You can fill in on the details. So I think, Karen, it's a really interesting question. And clearly when we go back in history and we look at some of the dynamics that are out there, particularly back to almost 2014 and 15 with the Northwestern case, a lot of these situations, a lot of these conversations occurred. And at that point in time, I would tell you from a risk management standpoint, there wasn't a lot of people getting overly excited or concerned about it, right? It was almost like, yeah, this might happen. Yeah, but are we really need to dive into it? Do we really need to figure out what the ramifications would be like? So I guess if we told you in late 2019 or early 2020, if we told you you really need to have a risk management around a pandemic shutting down your campus, you would probably told us, yeah, maybe I'm not too worried about it, right?
Right.
So I think I say all that because I really believe that it's all coming to a point where schools really need to pay attention to what's going on with some of these situations. So with the National Labor Relations Board opinion, when it came out, I think people started saying, wow, what if this really does happen? And what does it mean to my organization? What does it mean to how our infrastructure is set up? And, we look at it, we say, this is just basic risk management 101, right? Evaluate the situation, determine what the likelihood of the risk would be, weight that likelihood, look at the infrastructure, policies and procedures and governance that you have in place, and determine if there's a gap between where you are now and where you want to be. And that's what we're advising our schools to look at when they look at this particular situation. So, Adrienne, maybe a little bit more detail on that.
Yeah, what I think is really actually pretty interesting in this is, states enacted their own regulations. Many states enacted their own regulations in regards to NIL. And so now what we're seeing is, in light of this new guidance about how the National Labor Act is going to be potentially applied, now we're seeing schools who really had to wrap their heads around the NIL to begin with. Now they're saying, well, what does this mean in light of our own state's regulations? Because depending on the state, some states explicitly say athletes are not employees of the institution. So it's going to be really interesting to see how this evolves, especially since there seems to be conflicting and competing guidance here, right? You have state regs, but you have potentially federal application of this existing law. So yeah, Dave's absolutely right. You take a look at your policies and your procedures and your processes and any technology tools, but then you throw in the wrench of conflicting guidance here. So be interesting to see how it plays out.
And that assumes that they have written policies and procedures, but as you said, this has been a moving target for the last 9 months at least. And so if they don't have something in writing at this point, what kind of vulnerability does that leave for them?
I think that's a really great question. Dave and I have been talking to schools across divisions, and some of them are really well positioned. They knew the regulation or the change in guidance in terms of NIL was coming. Some of them helped draft the regulations or the executive orders for their state. So they were not surprised. They were not caught off guard. They had policies ready to go July 1. We have a lot of colleagues at smaller D1 schools, D2, D3, that are still trying to figure it out. What does this mean to us? I was on a call with some of my internal audit colleagues at some D3 schools, and they said, oh yeah, we heard about NIL, but that doesn't really apply to us. And we said, well, we're watching the data come in, in terms of who's participating at NIL, in NIL, and what are they reporting? And we're seeing a lot of activity at the D2 and D3 levels. So you need to be aware. And it caught one of our colleagues completely off guard, where she said, well, now I got to go talk to athletics. I got to see what we're doing. But it's definitely, not a one size fits all. It's across the spectrum about where people are in terms of being prepared for implementing this.
So, I think, Karen, with regards to the question of what the ramifications are, again, I'm trying to keep it as simple as possible. Anytime that you're trying to put out fires versus you being strategic and proactive in the way you're thinking, you're behind the gun. So, that's the biggest concern that we have. What happens to the already constraints that we're seeing on our leadership teams, our administration teams, with regards to just keeping focus on the mission. COVID has put us all in a very interesting situation, operationally challenged, financially challenged, and now we have all these different external factors pulling us in a lot of different directions. And we always try to get back to the core mission of most of our schools is really focusing on student success. And when you're pulled away from that to deal with all these other things, you're just not able to put the type of energy behind being a successful organization. So college athletics plays a really important role with regards to many of our institutions. That's the reason they got involved with it to begin with. But when it starts becoming more of a burden and we can't focus on what we really want to do with regards to those programs, we see things break down. And then what happens is you end up in the press, people lose their jobs. Nothing good happens from it when you're under this type of constraints and pressures.
I think a lot of schools, empathize with each other at this point because everybody's sort of flying by the seat of their pants because they're just trying to figure it out based on what their state law said, as you said, Adrienne. But also when these memos drop out of nowhere and it seems to, craft a whole new relationship, there are a lot of people, including Division I athletic directors and conference commissioners, who've said they're not employees. They're going to be student athletes if they try to unionize, so we don't treat them as employees. But in listening to the NLRB General Counsel in more detail on other communications, she's looking for plaintiffs. She is actively looking to advance and test this idea. So how would you advise an institution of a group of athletes decide to take her up on this and work with advocates who want to advance this issue? And I'm already aware of law firms that are also looking for plaintiffs.
Yeah. So I'm maybe going to answer the question in a little bit different direction with regards to how will we advise our clients with regards to getting in front of this situation. So I think we're going to end up in the same position at the end of the conversation. So I guess the first question is, why you ask yourself, why would our student athletes want to reach out to the NLRB? Why would they want to utilize? What would be the core problems that exist in our infrastructure, in our program, and the way we're coaching, mentoring, and handling our student athletes that would cause them this big concern? So that's my first question. I want to go out into my student population and ask them that question. So again, I mentioned the Northwestern case. When we go back to that situation, they pointed to health reasons. They pointed to better protocols around concussion. They pointed to future medical costs that the students may incur because of injuries while they're in a college. And they also pointed to monetary reasons, right? So if I'm asking my student athletes and I'm getting in front of that and being proactive in the way I'm doing that, again, it all relates back to ultimately getting back to student success and why we have the programs to begin with. So the first question is, all right, how do I get in front of it? What are the core situations? What do I need to address it? How can I address it? How can I have a very transparent and open communication with my student athletes? And then the second one is, who do I need in the room with regards to kind of helping me decide this, where I need to be? Adrian mentioned the NIL. Many of our schools formed very elaborate task force, legal counsel, the academic side of the equation, the leadership, compliance officers. All these people got in a room and they talked it through and they ended up kind of coming to the best solution. I think when it comes to situations like this, you need representation from the student athletes in the room as well to help you figure that out. So being proactive. And then there's organizations out there that also address this with regards to how they're looking at this and how we could pull in other thought leaders into the process as well. So again, step number one, be proactive, get in front of it. Why would they even go down this route? And, make sure that we're addressing those core problems up front.
Great. Adrian, what do you think?
Yeah, I think everything Dave said is spot on. And just to reiterate, the coordination across the university is going to be key. I think most institutions, this is no surprise to you, Karen, operate in a decentralized fashion. So, oftentimes it can be a challenge to get the right people at the table to talk about this, but it's going to be really key. And I think, Dave, your comment about making sure we have students at the table, that's going to be essential, right? Because we need to have the understanding of what is the pulse of our students. And I think if we're talking regularly, central administration with athletics administration, that's going to give us a real good clue into what our students are thinking, what our athletes are thinking. So, like Dave said, get the right people at the table, compliance, counsel, human resources in this case. We need to have understanding of what employment law is in kind of, what that area of expertise is, and just have a conversation. I think so many times we don't do that, right? And we kind of fall down. So that's going to be key. Everything that they've said, plus the enhanced communication.
Yeah, I think enhanced communication is really important. The schools that I worry about are the schools that you mentioned earlier, which are the less resourced, smaller schools that count on everybody wearing multiple hats, right? And the assumption is, what's going on in your program, what your athletes think. But one of the things I've learned in my research is that not a lot of schools effectively survey their athletes and give them an opportunity to anonymously provide feedback on their experience until they're out the door. So perhaps is there room in there for more engagement before it gets to the point where athletes are upset or possibly engaging outside legal counsel? What do you think?
I think absolutely. Our athletes are closest with their coaches, right? So they're talking many times a day, many times a week. I think there's an opportunity not only to, survey the athletes, but the coaches. There often seems to be a really big disconnect between athletics administration and coaches. Mm-hmm. So I think there's an opportunity to intersect more closely with the coaches in addition to the students. And you can do that in real time. I think that's our quickest avenue to the students. Although students these days are happy to tell you exactly what they're thinking in any type of mechanism, whether or not that's to you or it's on a smart device on our social media site. But I think there's a lot of opportunities to engage our student athletes in many different ways. Dave, what do you think?
Yeah, I would agree. I think the one thing that we've seen over the last 6 months in particular, particularly with regards to the NIL being passed, is that coaches, athletes, ADs, everyone seems to be much more engaged with understanding how they're working together for the common good of the organization, for the institution. Uh, we see schools putting in much more elaborate training, educational, financial literacy programs. We see schools engaging more with the broader population on the administration side. What type of infrastructure do we already have in place for our existing student population, and how could we engage them more directly with our student athletes, whether it's our Center of Entrepreneurism or it's our marketing and social media department or communication department. It seems like schools are really being more thoughtful with regards to holistically pulling together all those services. And I've been really encouraged with regards to what I'm hearing from our clients with the way they're thinking about this going forward.
So we've been talking about NIL. Adrian, you were recently quoted in an Inside Higher Ed article about names, image, and likenesses. Walk us through some of the key points you referenced, particularly the unfunded mandates, which I find very interesting, that institutions face, and the scrambling that compliance officers and others are experiencing trying to keep up with how to remain compliant with state law, if in fact there is one.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So, as we were talking about before, the change in guidance or application about NIL from the NCAA wasn't a surprise to many schools. Dave and I have been talking with a lot of our colleagues, both athletics and compliance across divisions and across the country. And, by and large, everybody knew this was coming. Like I said, several states had regulations ready to go and/or executive orders. Many schools in states were key as part of that. They were at the table with their regulators to help draft that. But what a lot of our colleagues at, like I said, smaller D1, D2, D3 schools weren't prepared for from a standpoint was the implementation of NIL. So we've been talking a lot about resources and staffing. And, even before COVID, a lot of institutions operate in a lean staffing environment. They may have one general counsel, they may have one attorney, one compliance officer, if any, and one person in athletics is really responsible for doing everything. So, like Dave has talked about, while institutions really want their athletes to be successful, broadly as students, as athletes, if that's something that the student wants to do, especially with regards to NIL, because not everybody in our conversations with institutions across the country, not all students really want to be a part of this, which is a different topic altogether. But if the students want to participate in NIL, these institutions want them to be successful. But they've got a lot going on in addition to all of the other compliance areas, all of the other NCAA compliance. Now they've got to comply with NIL. They've got to figure out how, like we were talking, to put a policy in place, which needs to be compliant with your state regs and/or with the NCAA guidance if there are no state regulations. Then, like Dave was talking about, you got to make sure that that's communicated out and people are trained on that. Students, coaches, administrators, they need to know what their roles and responsibilities are in relation to NIL and what they need to do to report. And then somebody's got to monitor that and broadly report that. That's in addition to their day jobs. They have all these other things that are going on. So, and that's just within athletics. You figure all of the other compliance areas that seem to grow, daily here in higher education. That's just one other thing that they have to do. And so they're not getting additional people. That the likelihood of that happening at many schools is pretty slim. So, that's when we say unfunded mandate, it's just one other thing that they have to do in addition to everything else to support students. And, they definitely want to support their students. Dave and I, as we've had our conversations with, administrators across divisions, they really want to be there for their students. They want them to be successful, but they're just struggling. They're not sure how they're going to do it. I was on a call with a smaller D1 school last week and with their athletics compliance officer, and they told me right now they're just saying no to NIL. They're just trying to figure out what it is. what their policies are going to be, how they're going to educate their students, how they're going to review or be involved in the compliance and monitoring aspect, and they can't do it right now. So which brings a whole different component, right? If they're saying no to NIL. So, Dave and I are really watching what this is going to mean for smaller, leaner schools. What does this mean on recruitment and retention? What are the potential impacts of NIL on mental health? And that's something completely different. Things related to equity, donor and advancement relationships. That's going to be really interesting to see. Community relationships. I don't think it's any surprise that a lot of institutions across the country have enrollment issues. And so, now schools are going to be faced and competing against more well-resourced schools, like Dave was talking about, schools that have infrastructures and programs and marketing and the support to, support NIL endeavors for students. And now these smaller, less resourced schools are going to be, potentially at a loss. So it'll be interesting to see how NIL plays out. There's a lot of kind of unanticipated things that are kind of emerging as a result of this. And it's a great opportunity. I think it's important to say that NIL is a great opportunity. It's just going to present a lot of new considerations for leadership to manage.
I'm really glad that you added the enrollment piece to this too, because I do think it's a retention opportunity for schools. And if they don't handle it correctly, it could inadvertently redirect athletes to other schools that seem to be handling it in a better way, giving them more opportunities or presenting them more options, have an entrepreneurship program already ready to go and your school's still struggling to put it together. So I see those as also risks that need to be mitigated as well. Dave, would you agree?
Absolutely, Karen. And so let's turn this into more of a positive conversation for our clients, because while we have to give them the concerns that we see out there, they're always going to come back and say, all right, well, Dave, what's my solution? Yeah. Well, sometimes the solution is just already stepping back and focusing on how to be in front of this situation. So, for example, we talked to a D3 school that says, Dave, I can't handle all this NIL. There's just way too much. I'm trying to get my hands around it. I said, well, look at it a different way. Don't look at it as something you have to do. Look at it as an opportunity to really market yourself against your competitors with regards to how you're getting in front of it and being able to brand yourself in your recruiting geography with your athletes and telling them, hey, you're going to come here, you're going to get a great education. We have a great support system. And by the way, we're really enthusiastic about helping you understand how to best position yourself on a social media platform. We're really interested in giving you some really basic understanding of what it means to earn money under the NIL concept and how that relates to your funding at the institution. So all these things are probably basic things that you're already doing, but being able to package it a little bit and get in front of it really could put you in a position where you could enhance yourself. Now, we always go back and forth with the question, where's that blurred line between what you can and cannot do with regards to the compliance rules and regulations, right? So you need to be able to put yourself in a position where you can help your student athletes, but you can't be contracting for them. You can't be promoting them in a way that violates the compliance rules. So this really puts, I think, particularly our coaches in a very difficult situation where, as Adrian mentioned, as a student athlete, I have a high level of trust and respect, and I'm going to go to my coaches time and time again. My wife and I have 4 children, and we have one right now that's a first semester running track at a D1 school. And we're going through all this with them. And we're like, hey, buddy, you need to talk to your coach. He's going to help guide you. She's going to help you figure all that out. But yet he can't go to his coach and say, hey, coach, I need some help with this NIL deal. I mean, should I do it or shouldn't I do it? And so these coaches are going to have to be able to really manage through that process in a way that they're doing what's right for the student athlete, but they don't have the compliance officer overlooking them, every time they say something. So, that's where we talk about this concept of consistent communication, consistent education, and consistent transparency with regards to what we're doing, why we're doing it, and why we believe it's in the benefit of not only the student athlete, and not just, Karen, not just one student athlete, right? This is about a larger population. So, I think that the fear that we're going to offend somebody and they're going to go file this suit, or they're going to complain or go to the paper, we can't we can't operate that way. It has to be a process where everyone collectively leaves that room. When that task force makes a decision, they walk out of there and they're all sync with regards to how they're going to communicate to the population.
I was just going to say, speaking with one voice is really important for all of the coaches, for not each coach to manage their own little empire and make their own little deals. Everybody has to be on the same page. Would you agree, Adrian?
Yeah, absolutely. And I want to reiterate something that Dave mentioned before. One of the key ways we're seeing a lot of success at schools, especially ones that don't necessarily have the resources to go out and hire and implement, full infrastructures, is really around taking stock of what you already have in place. For so many years, schools have been supporting student success through, life skills training and teaching them how to navigate difficult situations and, how to seek out help when they need it, for any number of reasons. So I think that there's a lot of infrastructure in place, and we're seeing this with some really good success, that schools can leverage to support their students and embed now, things related to social media. We've already seen for a number of years schools educating students on social media use, more in relation to mental health and how to have, control over that. But, there's really an opportunity to now add just something else, another dynamic in there, to how to use it to your benefit and how to control that and take ownership of it. So I think that there's a really big opportunity for, schools to inventory what they have in place, leverage all the stuff that they're really doing. It's lots of good stuff. And now kind of shift that and pivot that and help, in terms of preventive controls and preventive risk management. Because like Dave said, communication, education are your best weapons here, your best tools rather.
And also, just helping the athlete understand that you're developing your personal brand, right? And it's who you want the world to see. And all of this has to reflect positively on you. There'll be some people who will come to you with ideas that you're like, no, I'm not so sure I want to be associated with that. And others where you'll say, that's exactly who I'm aligned with, and helping athletes see that.
Right. And Karen, that's stuff that we teach our students anyway, right?
Yes.
Just as citizens, you have a digital footprint. It will follow you into your next, your after college life. So it's again, things that, our faculty and administrators have already been teaching students. It's just an added dynamic here that we're now just building upon.
So my last question is this, but I want to go from the small school focus to the big school, which is University of Texas. And they have done this amazing thing, which for decades would have been completely illegal. And everybody would have had a conniption about the fact that they have listed all of the teams and the athletes on their athletics department website with their Twitter, Instagram, and email address, so that any boosters can go directly to the athletes and sponsor their NIL. And Dave, should we have any worries about this, just eliminating all the barriers and boosters being able to go directly to the athletes that are currently on the University of Texas's rosters?
Well, look, I'm pretty convinced that the University of Texas has a very good group of individuals that made that decision and landed it as the best course of action for them and their student athletes. So as I mentioned earlier, there are rules with regards to bright lines on what we can or cannot do with regards to helping our student athletes. So that's the first one, to make sure that someone's not just arbitrarily reading what the University of Texas did here and say, hey, that sounds good, I think I'll do it over here, without knowing how that could potentially affect their state rules, their regulations, and what's involved with their institution. So that's the first caution. The second one is misinterpreting what we're really trying to solve here with regards to our connection with the boosters and the students, and everyone understands that it's in line with NIL policies. There's not some side conversation occurring or something going on that is not up on the board. I think so. laying it out there, I got to believe there's a very elaborate infrastructure behind this that really guides people through these courses of action. So I think the caution is just don't read it and take it for what it is, because a lot of what we're hearing out there is that there's a lot of our student athletes being contacted by different promoters, agents, and so forth. And it gets a little rough out there with regards to who you can trust and who you can't trust, what these contracts look like, what you're really signing, and so forth. So, when the institution's able maybe to harness a little bit and guide the parties in a better direction under the rules and regulations, I think you'll probably can end up at a better spot than just allowing a wild, wild west to occur out there and everyone's winging these contracts around. It gets back to the comment I mentioned earlier about just the coaches as well as being put in a position. I'm not sure how the coaches see all this, right? How does that play into it as well? So I think that's a part of the conversation as well. Do the boosters now get to attend the practices, right? Do they get to come on the field and talk to the athletes? What happens at the press conference? Who's involved? Who's not involved? So I think there's just a lot of things that probably need to be understood when we read this at its surface when we first look at it. But they're occurring all over the place, and we're seeing these types of deals, the collective bargaining deals all over. There are situations that exist to get a little bit within the nuances of the regulations. For example, international students have certain different rules with regards to their visas and what they could do or can't do with regards to earning money. So if you're going to give a certain blanket contract to your football players and everyone's involved, and you have some international students on the team, you got to weed through all that. So it could get a little bit dicey when you get into the details. Yes.
It's a great point. Adrian, to kind of wrap us up here, any tips or tricks that you've learned over the last few months that you'd like to offer to the audience?
I think it just goes back to making sure you have the right people in the room when you're figuring out how we're going to operationalize compliance. Going back to the Texas case, and we put on our enterprise risk management hat. Dave made a great, illustration there with the international students. Did we have somebody from global affairs? You probably never would have thought that you needed to have somebody from, international affairs, global affairs at the table. What about donor and advancement relations? If our boosters and our donors are allowed to go directly to our students broadly, does that mean they're going to potentially divert funds from the institution? And what impact could that have? So I think we just need to, continue to think at an enterprise, level and make sure we're getting everybody that could potentially be impacted. And we got to really think, what are all the areas that could potentially be impacted in addition to our student athletes and our coaches and athletics administration. Get the right people in the room, right seats in the bus, and then, that'll help drive your policy, your process in the right direction.
Yeah, we didn't really mention financial aid. The jury's still out about whether this will impact financial aid for athletes as well.
Yeah, that's a fantastic question because, back to, our student athletes, employees, well, there are different rules around, employee benefits around tuition and whether or not that's taxable. And then there's, potential legislation that's been proposed about taxing scholarships. And then you go back to the state regs, right? Which every state has a different take on whether or not scholarships can be touched by this. So yeah, just get the right people in the room. We're very lucky at our institutions that we work with. We've got a lot of smart people. Yeah. So, got to bring them all together. And we've seen a lot of success when that's done.
That's great. Well, Dave and Adrian, you've given us an awful lot to think about today. And I'm so glad we had this conversation. Definitely for our listeners, keep an eye on this space because it keeps changing quickly and dramatically. And if the NCAA and their constitutional convention ends up deciding to separate out the divisions or to make some major change, that could impact all of this as well. And of course, we'll know more about that over the next few months. Thank you both so much for joining us today. I really appreciate it.
Karen,
Karen, it
thank
was a
you so
pleasure.
much.
So